Welcome to the podcast of All Means All. In this episode, Jane O'Toole, Penny Dinh, and Nika Maglaperidze will talk about inclusive curriculum making.
Since we're talking about inclusive curriculum making, I think it's a highly pertinent question to ask, what is curriculum? And also, since this question at the same time is quite perplexing, because as teachers, when we ask ourselves what is curriculum, we kind of get a bit confused. And what I think this confusion is due to is because there is no one thing that we can call a curriculum. For example, the Canadian curriculum theorist Ted Aoki in 1984 said that to many people, curriculum is many things. And indeed, when you look at the literature on curriculum theory, we find out that, it means so many things. It comes in so many forms and shapes. It just depends on for example, what teachers or policymakers want to do with the curriculum. Or for example, some of the forms we can identify are the planned, the mandated curriculum. So this is something, for example, that gets determined more or less at the state level, at the macro level. And then you have the enacted curriculum. For example, the mandated curriculum, the planned curriculum needs to come alive in the classrooms, in schools, so we can call this enacted curriculum. And then, of course, we have the learned curriculum. This can be something that children learn from the enacted curriculum, something that they take away. Also, we can talk about curriculum that is assessed, for example, formative assessment, summative assessment, exams. This can be said to be the assessed aspects of the curriculum. These are all visible forms of curricula, right? But then there exists also some less visible forms of curricula. We can talk about the hidden curriculum, and the hidden curriculum means something that isn't written in the planned curriculum, isn't talked about openly by the teachers in the enacted curriculum or in the learned or assessed curriculum, but all the human relationships that take place within classrooms, within schools or within schoolyards can be said to be the part of the hidden curriculum. And also we can talk about lived curriculum. So this is the curriculum that children, teachers, other staff members experience based on the curriculum. And this is something that is unplanned. You can't plan it because it is unpredictable by its own nature. And Ted Aoki, that I mentioned at the beginning, speaks quite fluently about this. Also, we can talk about the null curriculum, which is something that intentionally gets omitted or gets left out from the curriculum for cultural, political reasons. And Flinders and Noddings talk very eloquently about this. And also, there are other forms of curricula, and in the chapter, there is a kind of a more nuanced delineation of these forms. But in this chapter, we would like to kind of stress the social aspects of curriculum making. So we want to kind of stress curriculum making as an action, as a process, as practice, rather than as something set in stone. We think that curriculum making takes place on multiple levels. So it takes place from supra-international organization level, so you have the OECD, you have the European Union, the World Bank, and other multilateral organizations that have influence on the curriculum making processes, all the way down to the classroom, which is the nano level, where you have teacher-student or student-to-student relationships and where the parents come in and everything. So we think that it is without humans, without children. There is no curriculum, of course, and then we think that looking at curriculum through this multilateral, multi-levels way gives us an idea as to how these multiple levels interact with each other, how schools influence curriculum making, how international organizations, local authorities and semi-autonomous agencies, NGOs also affect curriculum making. And I think this kind of opens up very nicely talk about inclusivity as well.
Many thanks to Nika for exploring the concepts, theory and practices in relation to curriculum and curriculum making. In this video, we will explore what inclusive means in terms of inclusive curriculum making. When we talk about inclusion and inclusivity in relation to curriculum making, what exactly might that mean? Are there multiple interpretations, and where might we start? UNICEF states that inclusive education means all children in the same classrooms, in the same schools, whereby real opportunities for learners who have been previously excluded. And this is not only children with additional needs, but speakers of minority languages and learners from diverse cultural backgrounds too are included. According to UNICEF, inclusive school systems respect and value the contribution of all learners from all backgrounds and enable diverse groups to learn side by side for the benefit of all. An inclusive school, for example, could be defined as a place where everyone belongs, is accepted, supports and is supported by his or her peers and other members of the school community in the course of having all their educational needs met, according to Johnson. At a school level, I suppose the central challenge around inclusive curriculum making is how to build and maintain a bridge between the principles of inclusion and enacting the school curriculum. And doing this, with pupils as partners in the joint class or group as a joint process. And what are the inner activities and practices at school level which may help achieve this? Before we visit that idea, we might look at Mel Ansco's view of inclusion as a process. Mel Ansco expressed this very clearly by saying that, I suppose, inclusive practice as a process is a key element to, a school progressing towards an inclusive turn. That it's not just a policy, it's not just a document, it's something we live every day. Also, other key elements to progressing to an inclusive turn at school level would be identifying and removing barriers for learners, the acknowledgement of student and stakeholder presence, participation and achievements. Also the involvement of all students with, I suppose, an emphasis and a greater focus on students in at-risk groups. And that by focusing on, issues of marginalisation, exclusion and underachievement at school and using school-based evidence on the ground as a lever for framing this inclusive practice, that this is a really good roadmap for schools to progress. I suppose that leads us to, the curriculum itself. And UNESCO identify school curricula as a means of enacting inclusive practice. According to Johnson, there's 7 key areas in taking a curricular approach to inclusion. And he identifies the pupils, educational outcomes, educational content, methods and organisation, assessment, in addition to communication and care. And these are all framed within the school context. And these 7 aspects of a curricular approach are concerned with the school's inner activities and link in with what Nika said about the micro level of inclusive curriculum making. And it's a bottom-up approach whereby the individual pupils and the school's partners engage with the curricula, and that's the central focus of all educators serving the community. In terms of more, explicit examples of inclusive curriculum making, traditionally adapting or differentiating the curricula or curriculum is a known and tried approach to inclusive curriculum making, where the needs of all learners, it's an established approach whereby, the curriculum is individualised, personalised for students. This can be done via an individual education plan, which is adapted in partnership with parents, the child in question, the educators, and it's revisited, revised, reviewed at regular intervals, and that represents one example of a school-level approach to inclusive curriculum making. Another approach would be universal design for learning, a relatively new concept, in education, but it's certainly gain momentum across education sectors. So Universal Design for Learning, or UDL as it's known, is a framework to guide the design of learning environments that's accessible and challenging for all learners. A key objective of UDL is to support learners become expert learners themselves. And the ultimate aim of UDL is to change the environment, adapt the environment, as opposed to change the learner. UDL guidelines by CAST can be utilised and explored as a tool to support educators and curriculum developers and all stakeholders in order to create opportunities for learning for all learners. In terms of higher education, inclusive curricula are currently under discussion, obviously, and being pursued. An inclusive HE curriculum could be described as being universal and intended to improve the experience, skills and attainment of all learners, and those principles of inclusivity that we've talked about are embedded within all aspects and stages of the academic cycle. Just a look at a take on 21st century inclusive curriculum making. And Lydia Arnold has done a good overview of this, suggesting that such a curriculum is open to discussion and ongoing development, whereby it meets the needs of diverse learners, uses diverse and interactive teaching methods, underpinned by compassionate and reflective engagement, is developed with a large range and broad range of stakeholders, all stakeholders, provides space for reflection, engagement and review, and is relevant and authentic to a given learning community. And finally, also addresses issues courageously while also being realistic. And I think such a vision of 21st century inclusive curriculum making encourages and recognises teacher and learner agency, in addition to the importance of engagement of all stakeholders in the proposed formulation and enactment of inclusive curricula.
So in this section, I'm going to cover what is inclusive curriculum making and what isn't. Teaching is a political act. What is included and excluded from what is taught in the classroom, and who gets to make the decision around this. The exclusion of Black history, the history of Africa, the Caribbean and their diasporas from the mainstream curriculum of the global north is a clear example of systematically exclusionary curriculum. This exclusionary practice in curriculum setting has been documented in a number of countries. For example, in 2020 in Wales, a curriculum working group set up by the government found no clear evidence on the extent to which existing school curricula address issues of race and diversity, or indeed any other specific issues or theme within history or the curriculum of any other subject. And additionally, they found major gaps in the available resources which support the teaching of Black, Asian and minority ethnic themes across the curriculum in Wales. Now, the case study of the curriculum in Wales, which has since undergone progressive reforms and with the mandating of the teaching of Black and Asian histories, highlights systemic racial biases within the school curriculum, and thus the need to decolonize the curriculum. And by this, we mean to acknowledge, unpack, and undo racist and colonial biases within the curriculum and knowledge production process as a whole. However, what happens when we simply add 1 or 2 lessons about Africa to the syllabus, leaving the rest of the syllabus unchanged? What if a school introduces a Black History Month where students learn and celebrate the history of Africa and its diasporas, with the rest of the year's lesson plans remaining untouched? Is that inclusive curriculum making? While these initiatives can be helpful, tokenistic additions to an otherwise exclusionary curriculum does not make the curriculum inclusive. An inclusive curriculum is where the inclusion of marginalized knowledge and people are integral to the curriculum as day-to-day practice. If the history of Africa, Asia, and elsewhere beyond Europe is included in the curriculum as normal practice, if historical figures of Black, Asian, and Indigenous heritage are frequently introduced to learners all year round, tokenistic initiatives such as Black History Month would become redundant. These initiatives would not be needed without the systemic exclusion of marginalized voices and knowledge from the mainstream curriculum. Making an inclusive curriculum also goes beyond this and requires the teacher to critically challenge and debunk dominant narratives in the curriculum, which cannot be done through adding marginalized voices to the curriculum alone. Writing about state-making propaganda through in Australian context, Arafis, Birakash, and colleagues argue that the pedagogy of the state brings certain histories into the present in order to secure particular futures. This pedagogical work can take multiple forms, as we have already touched upon, in the messages relayed through public holidays, in memorialization, in public images, in narratives, and in commemorations of national leaders and heroes. So yeah, these enter into education, curricula, and systems. So in a truly inclusive curriculum, the teacher or educator would not just present propagandic narratives that glorifies empires alongside a handful of marginalized voices. They would go further by recognizing and critiquing the problematic nature of the dominant narratives in the curriculum in the first place. Black feminists such as Patricia Hill Collins have attributed exclusionary biases in the knowledge that is produced, legitimized, and taught in the curriculum to the exclusion of marginalized and minoritized people in academic institutions. Writing in the US context, Hill Collins argues, because elite white men control Western structures of knowledge validation, their interests pervade the themes, paradigms, and epistemologies of traditional scholarship. As a result, US Black women's experience, as well as those of women of African descent transnationally, have been routinely distorted within or excluded from what counts as knowledge. Inclusive curriculum making then requires the teacher or educator to have awareness of historical, social, and political contexts that produce and reproduce suppression of marginalized knowledge. And as our colleague Jane has mentioned in the vision for an inclusive curriculum in the 21st century, this also requires working with a broad range of stakeholders, and that could include learners, families, and community members, especially those who are from traditionally excluded and marginalized backgrounds. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of All Means All. In the show notes, there is a link to the chapter in the open textbook. There you can find the transcript of the video and more information on the topic.